A man is shot dead in his driveway, executed like a common street criminal, but he was actually a top executive controlling the global reggae industry. His name was Joel Chin. Why was a powerful corporate leader assassinated at his home? Did the music mafia order Joel Chin's murder, or is there a deeper truth behind reggae's darkest mystery? Before you settle in and begin watching, I truly hope you might take a brief moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Moreover, if you are listening right now, feel free to leave a comment with your current location and local time. I am always incredibly curious to know exactly where in the world you are hearing my story from. The 35-year-old man bleeding out on the hospital gurney possessed a face entirely unrecognizable to the public. Yet, within the secretive, heavily fortified boardrooms of the global music industry, he was a formidable titan. As a silent, meticulous kingmaker, he held immense influence to dictate which voice and narrative would escape the impoverished, zinc-fenced ghettos of Jamaica. Backed by a formidable dynasty with deep ties to international distribution networks, he reigned as the senior executive within the planet's largest independent reggae label. The ballistics and the frozen police reports reveal only a fraction of the truth. The real motive lies hidden behind the facade of the entertainment business, buried in the mechanics of how power is brokered when millions of dollars intersect with extreme poverty. His name was Joel Anthony Chin. Born in Kingston on the 16th of June, 1976, his life was violently extinguished at the exact moment his professional and personal arcs were peaking. At 35, far from occupying a mere vanity role within the family business, Joel operated as the central nervous system of the company through his title as Director of Artists and Repertoire, universally known as A&R. To the outside world, A&R sounds like a glamorous administrative title. In the unforgiving reality of the Jamaican music industry, it is arguably the most dangerous job in the building. A formally trained audio engineer and gifted songwriter, Joel was a musical polymath. He possessed a terrifyingly accurate ear, a biological radar for commercial viability that could instantly separate a transient local club hit from a record that could sell millions of units across Europe and North America. Functioning as the ultimate gatekeeper, he became the heavily guarded toll booth through which an entire island's cultural identity had to pass. Beyond the corporate titles and platinum sales plaques, Joel Chin's murder was a profound family tragedy. He was assassinated just weeks after stepping into the most significant role of his life, fatherhood. He left behind his fiancée, Natasha, and a newborn daughter, Maya Juliana. His sudden death fractured a deeply connected family unit, leaving an irreplaceable void for his parents and siblings, and casting a shadow over a dynasty that had spent half a century building an empire from the ground up. The massive target painted on Joel Chin's back was intrinsically tied to the crushing weight of the crown he inherited. His immense power in 2011 was the calculated product of a relentless multi-generational commercial machine. Long before, Joel was sitting in air-conditioned boardrooms in New York, negotiating multi-million-dollar distribution deals with corporate behemoths like Atlantic Records. The foundation of his empire was being violently and brilliantly forged in the suffocating heat of downtown Kingston. He was the product of a community that possessed a cold, clinical genius for turning cultural friction and artistic desperation into hard, exportable currency. And this very inheritance, this deeply ingrained generational instinct to bridge the volatile gap between the impoverished, talented streets and the wealthy, consuming elite would eventually become the precise psychological and professional mechanism that led him to his execution in Stony Hill. The empire he was destined to rule was built on vinyl and magnetic tape, but its roots were watered by a very specific history of survival, migration, and the ruthless commodification of culture. And that habit of commodifying the streets is where the true danger was born. The Chin Empire was forged strictly through commerce, built upon an accounting ledger and a pile of discarded jukebox records, rather than artistic vision or social revolution. Beneath the romantic mythology of reggae music lies the cold, hard economic machinery that built its global pipeline and ultimately sealed this executive's fate. By the mid-20th century, the Chinese Jamaican demographic had systematically transformed into a formidable, tightly knit merchant middle class. They occupied a very specific economic niche, positioning themselves strictly as pragmatists navigating the space between the colonial ruling class and the impoverished black majority. When ska, rocksteady, and eventually reggae violently erupted from the zinc-fenced, impoverished districts of West Kingston in the late 1950s and 1960s, it was an art form forged in raw human suffering, political violence, and anti-colonial rage. Neighborhoods like Trenchtown, Tivoli Gardens, and Denham Town were bubbling over with extraordinary musical talent. But those creators possessed only the art. They lacked every single piece of industrial machinery required to monetize it. They had no access to capital, no knowledge of international copyright law, no vinyl pressing plants, and no logistical infrastructure to export their records beyond their immediate streets. The merchant class saw this cultural explosion not as a spiritual revolution, but as a massive, untapped commercial opportunity. While untouched by the socio-political struggles that invented the sound, the merchant class capitalized on it by building the essential toll booths. They provided the physical retail counters, funded the studio time, imported the raw vinyl compounds, and controlled the distribution supply chains. They became the indispensable commercial bloodline that siphoned raw, volatile street culture and converted it into exportable, highly profitable intellectual property. At the absolute apex of this mercantile transition were Joel's paternal grandparents, Vincent and Patricia Chin. In 1958, capitalizing on discarded jukebox records, they opened Randy's Record Mart at the chaotic epicenter of downtown Kingston. It quickly evolved into the central nervous system of the local music ecosystem, where the raw, desperate energy of the street collided directly with merchant-class capital. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Jamaican music was dominated by sound system culture, massive, mobile discotheques mounted on the back of flatbed trucks. Rival sound systems like Duke Reid's Trojan and Clement Coxone Dodd's Downbeat battled for street supremacy. To defeat a rival, a sound system operator required dubplates, exclusive, unreleased songs recorded directly onto soft acetate discs that no other operator possessed. Sound system man after sound system man walked into Randy's Record Mart, handing over hard cash to secure the latest pressings and exclusive cuts. Vincent Chin sat at the counter, tallying the receipts. Recognizing that retailing other people's records was merely capturing a fraction of the profit, Vincent and Patricia decided to capture the entire production cycle. In 1968, directly above the retail store at 17 North Parade, they constructed a recording facility. They named it Studio 17. While the ground floor shop served as the bustling marketplace, the newly built Studio 17 became the sacred ground where modern reggae was engineered. Despite its primitive equipment and walls lined with egg cartons, this space became the exact incubator where legends like Bob Marley and the Wailers committed their career-defining anti-colonial outrage to magnetic tape. The economic arrangement inside Studio 17 was straightforward, cold, and utterly transformative for the Chin family. In that era, the concept of publishing royalties or mechanical rights was virtually non-existent for Black Jamaican artists. The standard industry practice was simple. An artist or session musician walked up the stairs to Studio 17, recorded their performance, and was paid a flat, one-off cash fee, sometimes just a few Jamaican pounds, a warm meal, or a bottle of liquor. Once the artist took that cash and walked down the stairs back onto the hot streets of North Parade, their financial relationship with the song was legally terminated. The Chin family paid for the studio time, owned the analog tape, held the master recording, and owned the intellectual property in perpetuity. They could duplicate that tape, press it onto vinyl thousands of times, export it to the United Kingdom or Canada, and license it to international record labels for decades without ever paying another cent to the performer. This was the business model that built the Qin Empire. It was an environment of profound drama-filled contradictions. Upstairs in Studio 17, artists were screaming anti-capitalist, anti-establishment lyrics into the microphone, calling for the downfall of Babylon and the liberation of the oppressed. Downstairs in the iron safe of Randy's Record Mart, those very same songs were being logged as corporate assets, categorized by serial numbers, and filed away to generate long-term financial yield for a merchant family. This was the exact world into which Joel Chin's father, Clive Chin, was elevated. As the eldest son of Vincent, Clive grew up inside Studio 17. By the early 1970s, Clive took over production duties at the studio, demonstrating a brilliant ear for talent. It was Clive who produced the legendary 1971 instrumental track Java by melodica player Augustus Pablo, a record widely considered by music historians to be one of the foundational cornerstones of the dub genre. Clive understood the music intuitively, but he also inherited his father's strict understanding that ownership of the master tape was the only thing that mattered. When Joel Anthony Chin was born in Kingston in June 1976, this generational philosophy was hardwired into his biological and psychological inheritance. Raised in this ruthless mercantile environment, he viewed music strictly as a tangible, harvestable commodity rather than a form of emotional self-expression. He was taught that artists were volatile, emotional, and inherently unpredictable, but the master recording was stable, permanent, and legally binding. Joel inherited a profound clinical detachment, the ability to look at a raw, violent street anthem born out of Kingston's slums and instantly calculate its manufacturing cost, its retail price point, and its global licensing potential. This inherited worldview became his greatest strength in navigating high-stakes negotiations with global conglomerates. However, it also forged a dangerous blind spot: the belief that the strict, legalistic logic of corporate ownership could somehow seamlessly control the unpredictable and volatile nature of the streets. Up to this point, the Chin family's operation was a massive local success story, dominating the Jamaican music landscape from their stronghold at 17 North Parade. But as the 1970s progressed, the socio-political climate of Jamaica began to violently deteriorate. Civil war broke out between political factions, gun violence engulfed Kingston, and the merchant class found themselves directly in the crosshairs. The Chin family was forced to make a radical decision: pack up their master tapes, abandon Studio 17, and flee the island. And it was in the urban sprawl of New York City that this localized family business would mutate into an unstoppable global corporate juggernaut. The year 1976 in Jamaica was not merely a period of political unrest. It was a heavily armed, blood-soaked proxy war. The island was caught in the geopolitical crosshairs of the Cold War. On one side stood Prime Minister Michael Manley and his People's National Party, flirting openly with Fidel Castro's Cuba and democratic socialism. On the other side stood Edward Seaga's Jamaica Labor Party, heavily backed by American capitalist interests. The ideological battle did not take place in parliamentary debates. It played out in the claustrophobic, zinc-fenced garrison communities of West Kingston, fought by impoverished teenagers wielding smuggled M16 rifles and submachine guns. The streets were ablaze. Extortion, political assassinations, and gang warfare became the daily currency of the capital. For the Chinese Jamaican merchant class, who historically avoided political tribalism in favor of quiet commerce, this level of unchecked urban warfare was a death knell. They became highly visible targets for kidnapping, extortion, and armed robbery. The Chin family, observing the rapid collapse of civil order from their vantage point at 17 North Parade, recognized a chilling reality. You cannot run a lucrative music distribution business when your customers are too terrified of stray bullets to walk into your shop. They made the ruthless, pragmatic decision to abandon their physical real estate and flee the island. But here is where the true nature of their power is revealed. When the Chins packed their bags for the United States alongside their clothing and family heirlooms, they packed something infinitely more valuable: the master tapes. Massive, heavy reels of 2-inch analog magnetic tape containing the seminal vocal performances of Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Dennis Brown, and Augustus Pablo. In the music industry, possessing the master tape is the equivalent of holding the gold standard. The artists who bled, starved, and fought in the slums of Kingston stayed behind to face the political gunfire. The merchants boarded commercial flights to John F. Kennedy International Airport, carrying the intellectual property that would generate millions of dollars in mechanical royalties for the next half-century. This is the grotesque contradiction of the music's business. The creators are anchored to their trauma. The owners are perfectly mobile. Arriving in the United States in the late 1970s, Vincent and Patricia Chin surveyed their new environment. Bypassing the elite corporate towers of Manhattan, they anchored their operations directly within the working-class immigrant neighborhoods, understanding exactly who their consumers were. Hundreds of thousands of Caribbean immigrants were fleeing that very same political violence in Jamaica, settling in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and the borough of Queens. The Chins drove out to a working-class commercial strip in Queens, a neighborhood that, in a stroke of profound geographic irony, was named Jamaica. In 1979, on Jamaica Avenue, they opened a new storefront. They took their first initials, V and P, and established VP Records. The early days of VP Records resembled a gritty, relentless immigrant hustle rather than a glamorous entertainment conglomerate. They imported yams, hot peppers, and physical vinyl records from the Caribbean. But Vincent and Patricia quickly realized a massive logistical vacuum in the American market. When a Jamaican immigrant living in a freezing apartment in Brooklyn wanted to hear the latest reggae hit from home, American mega labels like Columbia or Warner Bros. Had absolutely nothing to offer them. The major labels viewed reggae as an unprofitable, niche novelty. VP Records weaponized this corporate ignorance. They became the ultimate bottleneck. They set up physical distribution networks, purchasing a fleet of unmarked white vans. Every single week, these vans would drive up and down the eastern seaboard, from the Bronx to Connecticut, down to Miami, delivering 7-inch and 12-inch vinyl singles to hundreds of independent mom-and-pop record stores. Beyond simply selling music, VP Records engineered a supply chain monopoly. If a gangster or a street kingpin in Kingston funded a recording session and pressed a hit record, that record was financially useless in the lucrative American market unless it sat in the back of a VP Records delivery van. The street dons who commanded absolute lethal authority in the Kingston ghettos had to pick up the telephone, call a modest retail shop in Queens, and politely negotiate for shelf space. The boardroom had successfully outmaneuvered the cartel by controlling the logistics. While Vincent and Patricia built this ruthless, efficient distribution machine, Joel Chin's father, Clive, represented the fading soul of the operation. Clive Chin did not immediately flee to New York. He stayed behind in Jamaica a little longer, deeply entrenched in the artistic process. Clive was the generational bridge. He was a master producer who operated during the golden age of roots reggae and dub in the 1970s. Clive's power was not exercised through spreadsheets, but through frequency and vibration. He was the man who sat in Studio 17, rolling marijuana, manually splicing magnetic tape with razor blades, and pushing faders on a heavy analog mixing desk. Clive worked intimately with Augustus Pablo, utilizing the melodica, a cheap plastic wind instrument that sounded like a wheezing accordion, and bathing it in heavy tape delay and reverb to create the haunting apocalyptic sound of dub music. Clive respected the artists because he was one of them. He spoke their language. He understood that the music was a spiritual anti-colonial outcry. But as the calendar turned into the 1980s, the entire architecture of Jamaican music violently shifted. The analog era, defined by live drummers, heavy bass guitars, and spiritual Rastafarian lyrics, was suddenly dead. In 1985, a producer named King Jammy released a track called the Sleng Teng Rhythm. It was entirely digital, created on a cheap, mass-produced Casio MT40 keyboard. This technological shift birthed dancehall music, and it completely altered the arithmetic of the industry. You no longer needed a massive studio, expensive microphones, or a 5-piece band to make a hit record. You just needed a drum machine, a synthesizer, and a small room. The music became faster, cheaper to produce, incredibly aggressive, and heavily focused on gun violence, extreme materialism, and hypersexuality. The volume of music being produced in Kingston exploded exponentially. In the 1970s, a producer might spend a month recording a 10-track album with one band. In the late 1980s dancehall era, a producer would create a single 2-minute digital instrumental, a rhythm, and record 50 different rival artists singing over that identical beat in a single weekend. How do you monetize 50 different artists fighting over the same backing track? How do you package that chaotic, hyper-violent street energy and sell it to the world? Clive Chin, the analog purist, struggled to adapt to this soulless, rapid-fire digital economy. But his son, Joel, was coming of age at the exact moment this digital tsunami hit New York. Joel was a child of the 1980s. He grew up walking between two radically different worlds. In his father, he saw the artistic integrity, the perfect pitch, and the spiritual weight of the music. In his grandparents, Vince and Patricia, he saw the ruthless, unsentimental machinery of corporate distribution. Joel Chin's fatal weakness, his ultimate blind spot, was forged in this unforgiving generational crossfire. He developed a desperate driving psychological need to embody both extremes. He wanted the street credibility and the artistic respect that his father commanded in the studio, but he also wanted to wield the absolute, guillotine-like corporate authority of his grandparents. He believed he could step into the chaotic, blood-soaked arena of dancehall and tame it using a combination of his father's musical genius and his grandparents' legal contracts. By the early 1990s, BP Records was no longer just a small immigrant storefront on Jamaica Avenue. It was a multi-million-dollar independent powerhouse. They controlled the pressing plants, they controlled the delivery vans, and they controlled the lucrative American copyright registrations. They were the undisputed gatekeepers. But the business of dancehall was becoming increasingly hostile. The artists in Jamaica were no longer naive teenagers happy to sing for a warm meal and a flat fee. They were highly organized, fiercely territorial, and backed by local enforcers who understood the immense financial value of their intellectual property. To wield power over this new, aggressive generation of artists, you could not simply sit behind a mahogany desk in a corporate suite. You had to look them in the eye. You had to understand exactly how much they were worth. And more importantly, you had to know how to tell a dangerous man that his music was not good enough for international distribution. The Chin family demanded that their crown prince learn the true value of $1 directly from the people who bled for it. Before Joel Chin could ascend to the executive suite, he was stripped of his privileges and sent down to the ground floor. He was ordered to stand behind the retail counter of the VP Records store on Jamaica Avenue, face to face with the consuming public. And this is where the sterile, calculated corporate world directly collides with the unforgiving reality of the streets. The retail floor of a record shop is the most brutally honest environment in the global music industry. You can manipulate radio charts, you can bribe disc jockeys, and you can manufacture artificial hype through aggressive street marketing, but you cannot force a working-class immigrant to hand over $10 for a piece of plastic unless that music resonates in their bones. In the early 1990s, before he was permitted to sit in the executive boardrooms and negotiate million-dollar publishing deals, Joel Chin was ordered to stand behind the glass counter of the VP Records retail store on Jamaica Avenue in Queens, New York. This was his crucible. The Chin family dynasty did not believe in granting unearned authority to their heirs. If Joel was to one day inherit the crown, he had to first understand the exact anatomical structure of the consumer. On Jamaica Avenue, during a freezing New York winter, hundreds of Jamaican and Caribbean immigrants, wrapped in heavy coats, would step off the E&F subway trains and walk into the VP Records store. These were people working grueling, 12-hour shifts as nurses, construction workers, and transit operators. They had incredibly limited disposable income. When they walked up to Joel Chin at the counter and asked to listen to the latest imports from Kingston instead of avant-garde artistic experimentation, they sought a sonic tether to the island they had left behind. They wanted the raw, unfiltered pulse of the dance hall. Standing behind that counter, Joel developed a terrifyingly accurate psychological profile of the audience. He watched their body language. He observed exactly how many seconds it took for a customer to nod their head to a bass line, and precisely at what point they would either pull out their wallet or ask him to skip to the next track. This was a forensic education in commercial viability. He learned that what was a massive, violent hit in a Kingston nightclub did not necessarily translate to a commercial sale in New York. A song might have immense street credibility in Jamaica, but if it lacked a memorable hook, a clean vocal delivery, or a universally relatable theme, the diaspora in America would refuse to buy it. Joel Chin absorbed this data like a supercomputer. He learned to separate his own subjective musical taste from the cold, hard mathematics of consumer demand. This is a trait that destroys most executives. They sign artists they personally like, and they bankrupt their companies. Joel learned to sign artists that the working-class diaspora was desperate to buy. The retail floor was his lie detector test, and having passed that test with absolute clinical precision, he was elevated to the executive suite. In his early 20s, an age when most young men in the music industry are fetching coffee or carrying equipment, Joel Chin was appointed as the Director of Artists and Repertoire, commonly known as A&R, for VP Records. He was now operating directly alongside his grandmother, Patricia, his uncle, CEO Christopher Chin, and President Randy Chin. But this ascension was fraught with a suffocating internal psychological pressure. To the outside world, he was the golden child. Internally, he was plagued by the curse of nepotism. In a massive, sprawling family enterprise, the heir apparent is always viewed with intense suspicion by the veterans who built the company. Joel knew that every single producer, artist, and rival executive looked at him and saw merely the grandson of the founders. They saw a privileged kid who grew up in the safety of New York, a boy who had never dodged a bullet in Trenchtown or starved in a recording studio. Joel's driving motivation, his absolute obsession, was to surgically remove that stigma. He did not just want to manage the wealth his family had accumulated. He wanted to prove that he possessed an autonomous, unparalleled genius for identifying talent. He had to prove that he was not merely the beneficiary of a dynasty, but its most lethal weapon. His immense power stemmed directly from the chaotic reality of an A&R executive in the Jamaican dancehall industry. In standard American pop music, an A&R representative scouts talent, signs them to a label, pairs them with a producer, and oversees the recording of an album. It is a relatively straightforward, linear process, but in the Jamaican dancehall industry of the 1990s, the role of A&R was a chaotic, high-stakes game of three-dimensional chess. Dancehall does not operate on the traditional album cycle. It operates on a hyper-accelerated, decentralized manufacturing model centered around the redeem. A producer in Kingston will create a single digital instrumental track, a redeem. Instead of giving that instrumental to one artist, the producer will invite 20, 30, or even 40 different artists into the vocal booth to record their own unique lyrics over that exact same beat. The producer then releases all 40 versions into the streets simultaneously. The street dances, the sound system operators, and the local radio DJs act as the gladiatorial arena. They play the tracks, and the crowd response dictates the victors. This is where Joel Chin's terrifying power came into play. Out of the 40 artists who voiced a track over a popular rhythm, only a fraction actually mattered in the global marketplace. VP Records would package these tracks into compilation albums to sell internationally. Joel Chin was the man who had to listen to all 40 versions and decide which 10 or 12 tracks would make the final cut. His ears had to function as a ruthless filtration system. He had to instantly identify which artist had captured the definitive cadence, the sharpest lyrical delivery, and the most infectious melody. Beyond mere artistic critiques, his selections functioned as definitive financial executions. When Joel Chin selected 12 artists for a compilation, he was simultaneously handing down a death sentence to the 28 artists he rejected. A 20-something, highly educated executive sitting in a safe, climate-controlled office in Queens is listening to a demo tape recorded by a hardened, desperate young man living in a zinc-fenced garrison in West Kingston. For that young man, music is not a hobby. It is not an extracurricular activity. It is the only viable exit strategy from extreme poverty and gang violence. If Joel Chin signs his track, that artist receives a financial advance, international distribution, radio play in London and Miami, and the opportunity to secure lucrative touring visas. If Joel Chin tosses that CD into the bin, that artist remains trapped in the slum. This is the exact point where corporate policy breeds lethal consequences. The issue is how power is exercised. Joel Chin held the keys to the kingdom, and in the music business, the gatekeeper is always the most hated man in the room. When you say yes to one artist, you become their savior. When you say no to 50 others, you become an obstacle to their survival. You breed a deep, festering, invisible resentment. In the highly territorial, hyper-masculine world of Jamaican music, rejection is rarely processed as a mere business decision. It is often perceived as a profound personal disrespect. And in environments where legal recourse is unavailable, perceived disrespect is frequently settled through intimidation, extortion, or violence. Joel was navigating an industry where the artists were often backed by neighborhood dons, street-level kingpins who funded the recording sessions with illicit capital and expected a return on their investment. If a don backed an artist and the A&R in New York refused to distribute the record, the tension immediately escalated from a corporate disagreement to a volatile street conflict. Joel handled this pressure with a cold, almost detached brilliance. He was not intimidated by the aggressive posturing of the artists or their entourages. He utilized his inherited merchant logic. He focused entirely on the arithmetic of the song. He would fly down to Kingston, walk directly into the claustrophobic, smoke-filled studios, and stand shoulder to shoulder with men who commanded lethal authority on the streets. He would listen to a track, shake his head, and tell a man twice his age and infinitely more dangerous that the vocal mix was flat, the lyrics were weak, and VP Records would not distribute it. He commanded respect because his ear was exceptionally sharp. Even his harshest critics in the Kingston studios had to admit that if Joel Chin said a record was a hit, it inevitably sold hundreds of thousands of copies. He possessed a unique, hybrid vocabulary. He could speak the raw, unfiltered patois of the Kingston streets to a dancehall artist, and 3 hours later he could sit on a conference call with white corporate executives at a major American label and articulate market penetration strategies using pristine boardroom terminology. This duality made him the most valuable asset in the entire Chin empire. But it also isolated him. He was too corporate to be fully trusted by the streets, and he was too deeply entrenched in the gritty reality of dancehall to be fully understood by the corporate executives in Manhattan. He was a man suspended between two warring factions, functioning as the singular bridge over which millions of dollars flowed. As the late 1990s approached, the volume of that financial flow was about to increase exponentially. Joel had mastered the retail floor. He had successfully navigated the nepotism trap to assert absolute control over the A&R department. He had learned how to manage the volatile, dangerous egos of the Kingston recording studios. Up to this point, everything is still relatively stable. The ecosystem, while dangerous, was contained. VP Records was a massive independent label, but it was still operating within its specific demographic niche. Then, Joel Chin made a singular visionary decision that shattered the ceiling of the genre. He discovered an artist who did not fit the traditional mold of a rugged, aggressive dancehall enforcer. He found a smooth-talking, rhythmically gifted artist who possessed a crossover appeal that the genre had never seen before. Selling records to the Caribbean diaspora was no longer enough. Joel intended to force the raw, pulsating energy of the Kingston dance halls directly into the mainstream American pop charts. He wanted to sit at the table with the corporate billionaires. To do that, he had to sanitize the product, package the streets in a highly polished wrapper, and execute the most lucrative joint venture contract in the history of reggae music. He was about to turn a localized cultural movement into a billion-dollar global industry, and this is exactly where the corporate world meets the cartel. The stakes were no longer about street credibility or local radio play. They were about multi-platinum certifications, international stadium tours, and unimaginable sums of capital. And when that amount of money floods an unregulated system, the people holding the gate keys become prime targets. The year 1999 presented a profound geographical and financial ceiling for the Chin Empire. By this point, VP Records had entirely monopolized the Caribbean diaspora. If you walked into a West Indian barbershop in Brixton, a heavily Jamaican neighborhood in Toronto, or a block party in Brooklyn, the acoustic environment was strictly controlled by the Chin family's distribution network. But Joel Chin, sitting in his office in Queens, understood the cold mathematics of demographic limitation. Selling hundreds of thousands of records to immigrant communities generated massive wealth, but it was not mainstream, billion-dollar pop supremacy. The music was still confined to specialist radio hours and niche retail sections. To shatter this ceiling, the raw, aggressive, and highly territorial sound of the Kingston dance halls had to be scrubbed, sanitized, and forcefully injected into the mainstream arteries of MTV and global commercial radio. Joel needed a Trojan horse, a highly specific, commercially viable vessel that could carry the rhythm of the Jamaican underclass directly into the affluent white suburbs of America and Europe. He found that vessel in a young, relatively unknown artist named Sean Paul Enriques. When Joel Chin signed Sean Paul to a long-term contract in 1999, it was not merely an artistic discovery, it was a stroke of ruthless demographic genius. Through the clinical, unsentimental lens of a corporate A&R executive, Sean Paul was the ultimate demographic anomaly in the dancehall ecosystem. He did not emerge from the violent, zinc-fenced garrison communities of West Kingston. He was a middle-class uptown kid with a multicultural heritage who played on the Jamaican national water polo team. He did not possess the terrifying gang-affiliated aura of the traditional dancehall dons, nor did he rely on hyper-violent, untranslatable street slang. This is the brutal reality of mainstream pop radio. The corporate programmers in New York and London want the exotic, pulsating rhythm of the Caribbean, but they are terrified of the authentic, aggressive reality of the men who actually create it. Joel Chin recognized this exact prejudice. He saw in Sean Paul an artist who possessed an impeccable rhythmic cadence and undeniable authenticity, but wrapped in a highly approachable, visually marketable, and unthreatening package. Sean Paul was the perfect conduit. Joel oversaw the creation of Sean Paul's debut album, Stage 1, released in 2000. It laid the groundwork, testing the global waters. But it was the meticulous, obsessive corporate engineering behind the 2002 follow-up album, Dirty Rock, that permanently detonated the ceiling. Under Joel's direct creative supervision, Dirty Rock was subjected to a rigorous process of acoustic gentrification. Joel sat in the studios, working with producers to take the heavy, distorted, speaker-rattling bass lines of the Kingston street dances and compress them into clean, pristine frequencies that would sound perfect on mainstream pop radio and in suburban shopping centers. He identified tracks like Gimme the Light and Get Busy and engineered them to be irresistible global anthems. The strategy was devastatingly effective. Dirty Rock did not just sell records. It triggered a cultural avalanche, achieving multi-platinum status worldwide and securing a Grammy Award. The sheer financial magnitude of this success forced the titans of corporate America to the negotiating table. Atlantic Records, a massive subsidiary of the Warner Music Group, recognized that they could not replicate the street-level authenticity of VP Records, while VP recognized they needed Atlantic's bottomless radio promotion budgets to sustain global dominance. A historic joint venture was executed. The independent family business from Jamaica Avenue was now formally shaking hands with Wall Street. This corporate handshake fundamentally altered how Joel Chin exercised his power. He was no longer just the gatekeeper to the diaspora. He was the gatekeeper to mainstream global superstardom. When he walked into a recording studio in Kingston, the artists were no longer just looking at a man who could get their records sold in Brooklyn. They were looking at a man holding a master key to multi-million-dollar Atlantic Records distribution deals, global MTV rotation, and collaborations with American pop superstars like Beyoncé. The financial stakes in the Kingston studios multiplied overnight. And in a socio-economic environment where a few $1,000s can routinely trigger extreme violence, injecting millions of corporate dollars into the ecosystem without adequate security infrastructure is akin to pouring aviation fuel onto an open fire. Yet Joel Chin's genius was not limited to breaking singular, crossover megastars like Sean Paul. His most consistent, powerful, and ruthless mechanism for monetizing Jamaican culture was his absolute mastery of the compilation album. While American record executives chased individual artists, Joel understood that the true, reliable corporate dividend lay in packaging the culture itself. He was the chief architect and artistic director for VP Records' two most legendary annual compilation franchises, Strictly the Best and Reggae Gold. The true power of these compilations was born out of dancehall's chaotic manufacturing model. In Jamaica, music is decentralized. A producer releases a single rhythm track, and 40 different artists record their own vocals over it, releasing them simultaneously into the streets. It is a fragmented, hyper-competitive, and confusing marketplace for the casual foreign consumer. A teenager in London or a college student in California does not have the time, the cultural context, or the resources to hunt down 40 different, badly pressed 7-inch vinyl singles shipped from Kingston. Joel Chin solved this problem through extreme corporate curation. He would sift through the thousands of raw, disjointed tracks produced in Jamaica every year. He would use his infallible ear to isolate the 15 or 16 absolute best songs, the tracks that had survived the gladiatorial combat of the local sound systems. He would then secure the licensing rights, take the tracks into a New York mastering suite, clean up the audio frequencies, and sequence them into a single, cohesive, perfectly balanced 70-minute compact disc. This was the alchemy of the A&R department. He took the volatile, uncoordinated chaos of the streets and repackaged it into a highly predictable, beautifully branded annual corporate product. The visual branding of Reggae Gold was a master class in marketing disconnect. The album covers rarely featured the rugged, hardened artists who actually sang the song. Instead, the covers displayed glossy, high-fashion photographs of beautiful, scantily clad women posing on pristine Caribbean beaches or leaning against expensive sports cars. This visual strategy was entirely intentional. Joel was stripping away the poverty, the political violence, and the grime of the Kingston ghettos, replacing it with a sanitized, highly sexualized, and universally appealing aesthetic. He was selling the intoxicating fantasy of the Caribbean to the world, while carefully hiding the traumatic reality of its origins. You could walk into a massive, sterile corporate retailer like HMV in London or Target in the United States and purchase Reggae Gold right off the front display shelf. You were buying a polished, safe proxy of street rebellion. The financial efficiency of this model was staggering. Because VP Records often owned the underlying distribution rights, or licensed the tracks for flat fees, the profit margins on Reggae Gold and Strictly the Best were astronomical. They did not have to fund massive, expensive marketing campaigns for individual artists. The brand name of the compilation itself became the primary selling point. Every single summer, like clockwork, the diaspora and the crossover mainstream eagerly awaited the release of Reggae Gold to tell them what the definitive soundtrack of the year was. In fact, the sheer dominance of this strategy was proven right up until the end. Reggae Gold 2011, the compilation Joel finalized just before his murder, sat immovably at the #1 position on the Billboard Reggae charts for 6 consecutive weeks. But beneath the platinum plaques and the glossy album covers, the psychological toll of this curation was quietly festering. When Joel selected 15 artists for Reggae Gold, those individuals received global exposure, increased booking fees, and a direct pipeline to international royalty checks. But to select those 15, Joel had to actively reject hundreds of others. He was the man drawing the line between those who escaped the poverty trap and those who were forced to remain in it. In a rational corporate environment, a rejected artist simply returns to the studio to record a better demo. In the deeply impoverished, heavily armed garrisons of Kingston, rejection is rarely processed with such professional detachment. Joel was acutely aware of this tension. He knew that the corporate machine he had helped build in New York was slowly detaching itself from the spiritual, grassroots reality of the music. The more VP Records partnered with giants like Atlantic, the more the business became about quarterly earnings, cross-promotional marketing synergy, and focus groups. Joel was a man who possessed perfect pitch. He was an audio engineer who loved the tactile reality of magnetic tape and the raw, unpolished energy of a live recording session. He began to feel a profound, suffocating disconnect. The New York boardroom, with all its safety and its millions, felt sterile. The corporate packaging of the streets was making him immensely wealthy, but it was starving his artistic soul. This internal conflict brings us to the most critical, fatal juncture in his psychological profile. Joel Chin possessed the arrogance of the brilliant. He genuinely believed that because he understood the sonic architecture of the music better than anyone alive, he also understood the violent, unpredictable men who created it. He believed that his corporate authority, his financial leverage, and his bloodline made him untouchable. He grew tired of ruling the empire from a safe, comfortable distance in Queens. In 2009, driven by a deeply romantic desire to spark a roots reggae renaissance and bypass the glossy album covers, Joel executed a decision that would seal his fate. He packed up his life, turned his back on the safety of the New York executive suites, and relocated permanently back to Kingston, Jamaica. For 30 years, the Chin family's survival relied on a heavily fortified geographic buffer. If a disgruntled artist was furious about a rejected contract, they could make violent threats from a studio in Trenchtown, but they could not physically reach the executives safely insulated in Queens. By returning to Kingston, Joel voluntarily dismantled that buffer. He took the ultimate gatekeeper of the world's largest reggae label and placed his physical body directly into a volatile ecosystem where murder is routinely contracted for a few $100s. He stripped away the armor of New York and stepped completely exposed into the gladiatorial arena. Operating directly out of Kingston, Joel shifted his A&R focus heavily towards the contemporary roots reggae revival. This was a movement of artists who were rejecting the digital drum machines and the violent lyricism of the 1990s, returning instead to live instrumentation, heavy bass lines, and conscious, spiritually uplifting Rastafarian messages. Joel became the guiding architectural force behind a new generation of sophisticated, deeply musical artists like Tarrus Riley, Dwayne Stevenson, and Etana. He was in the studio, painstakingly producing albums that sounded organic, lush, and culturally profound. He was attempting to cure the toxicity of the industry with high art. He was actively trying to steer the massive financial machinery of VP Records away from the violent street anthems and towards music that elevated the consciousness of the island. But this is where the drama-filled contradictions of his life reach a boiling point. You cannot operate a billion-dollar cultural pipeline from the epicenter of a poverty-stricken, heavily armed capital city and expect to remain a neutral observer. Joel was no longer a voice on a conference call. He was a physical presence. He was driving his car through the streets of Kingston. He was walking into local studios where rival factions operated. He was visible. In the highly decentralized, unregulated ecosystem of Jamaican music, power is fiercely contested. The men who fund the street-level recordings, the local dons, the independent producers, the cartel figures who use the music industry to launder money and project power, do not respect corporate titles. They respect leverage. And suddenly, the man with the ultimate leverage, the man who could make or break an artist's international career with a single signature, was living right in their backyard. Joel Chin's fatal miscalculation was his belief that the artists and the street factions would separate his corporate role from his physical reality. He believed he could reject a dangerous man's music in the morning, based purely on objective acoustic quality, and then drive home to his quiet, affluent suburb in Stony Hill at night, completely untouched. He failed to recognize that in an environment starved of capital, a rejected business proposal is never just business. It is a direct threat to survival. As the calendar turned to 2011, Joel was deeply immersed in what he considered to be his absolute masterpieces. He was operating at the peak of his creative and corporate power. He was a new father, a visionary executive, and a man who believed he had successfully bridged the impossible divide between the boardroom and the streets. He had absolutely no idea that the very infrastructure he had built, the very culture he had commercialized, was quietly contracting around him in the dark. The final projects he was working on were designed to be monumental celebrations of Jamaican musical history. Instead, by a grotesque twist of fate, they would become his own eulogies. By the summer of 2011, Joel was no longer just discovering talent. He was archiving Jamaica's musical history. He was co-producing We Remember Gregory, a massive tribute to Gregory Isaacs, and curating the Reggae Golden Jubilee for the nation's 50th independence anniversary. The global release date for the Gregory Isaacs project was Tuesday, August 16, 2011. Tragically, at the exact moment record stores in London, New York, and Tokyo were unboxing his meticulously crafted tribute, Joel Chin lay bleeding on the concrete of his Stony Hill driveway. He was assassinated on the very day his masterpiece reached the public. The immediate aftermath was a collision of human trauma and corporate pragmatism. While close friends like reggae artist Deno recorded emotionally devastating tracks mourning a lost brother, the global machine Joel built was forced to process his death publicly. VP Records organized a massive tribute concert intertwined with their annual compilation launch. The stage was flooded with megastars who had secured international wealth through Joel's strategies. Ultimately, the corporate coping mechanism for the violent execution of its chief architect was simply to ensure that the assembly line never stopped moving. Viewed through the cold lens of a cold case file, the investigation remains a dark, unresolved nightmare. Detectives explored multiple angles, industry rivalries over shelved contracts, extortion attempts, and personal disputes, but the strict code of silence in the Kingston underworld held firm. Crime Stop Jamaica offered a substantial reward for information. Converted to United States currency, the bounty placed on the head of a man who brokered multi-million-dollar Atlantic records deals equated to roughly $12,000. More than a decade has passed. The police files remain frozen and the assassins remain free. Joel Chin spent his life obsessively manipulating audio frequencies to bring clarity to the chaos of the street. Yet his own story ends not with clarity but with a lasting unresolved silence.